So, as we've discussed throughout this course, subjectivity refers to the ways in which individuals are discursively and effectively composed by social political realities and how these realities inform existence. Our values, our ways of knowing and being in the world. These subjective processes are always at play unconsciously and consciously, and propose the ways in which we are able to access and exercise power differentially, how we perform agency. So in post-foundational theory, there's a sort of death of the individual, as we've discussed in previous weeks. The death of the person in philosophy happens as there's the notion that we are constructed of multiplicities. There is no one self or location of the self, because the human is constantly being composed and recomposed in relation with moving social discourse and singularities. It's not only you here that think your thoughts. These thoughts are informed by long histories of social thinking that play themselves out in the thoughts that you think. So subjectivity in this way is how an individual self is really constructed relationally, and it's an identity and a way of being and knowing in the world that is actively informed by social political forces. It's not stagnant, and it's always becoming. It's never stable. So the notion of subjectivity assumes that humans are not static or objective. We're not predetermined by solely biological truths, but rather we're continuously in interaction and response with social systems and structures, including materials and place, that create how we come to know and understand ourselves and the world, what kind of lives we live, and how we pursue them. So from a social constructivist perspective, subjectivity is constructed by and through human discourse, through social relations and language. That is, people become through the stories that are told of them and around them, the stories that they're immersed in. From a post-human perspective, subjectivities are also made and remade in relation with other matter, that we are materials of the world and there's no contained self-existence. Post-humanism suggests that it's not only the human that counts here in discourse. So as we've discussed, education is very much a project in creating subjectivities. This idea that thinking is never truly novel is important in how we imagine and we construct the educator, to consider our ways of seeing, listening, and knowing the world, and how these ways of knowing have come from a legacy of thought and theory, non-neutral theories that come from histories that are predicated largely, especially in education, by the legitimacy of colonial exploitation and expansion, where particular knowledges that center a very particular human have become legitimized and others discredited. So post-human theory makes visible that the very discourses of humanity continue to separate us from the dynamic material world in which we really are dependent. And so these orientations to education, again, come with long histories, and their values create the answers to a core pedagogical question that guides education, no matter what theory you come from. What is education for? What kind of subjects will be produced in educating? So our theoretical orientations inform how we think knowledge is made, how it positions us as humans, how does it position the child, and what does this do with your relations with materials? What does it call on you to notice? And what kind of subject does it create in material worlds? So in the articles this week, Lenz Taguchi speaks about processual ontologies as based on the premise that being is dynamic and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. He also speaks about, again, ontology as the study of being and becoming. It's concerned with how something is lived and comes to matter and change because of its relational existence. So post-human philosophy considers relational processes, and this influences how a post-human pedagogical orientation would view the child and the educator. So an emergent curriculum that thinks with post-human philosophy and materialism would think through a pedagogy of listening that attends not only to what children are saying, which is important as well, but also we're listening for interactions and gestures that are posed by more than human others. So thinking beyond linguistic accounts of human and more than human relations in childhood studies that frequently draw from a Derridian take of the world that comes from Jacques Derrida, a seminal post-structural theorist who attends to the ways in which language creates realities and subjectivities. Again, Derrida would come from a social constructivist perspective. We can also view pedagogy from a new materialist, feminist new materialist lens as a frame in thinking toward a pedagogical orientation that attends to the ethical tensions and differential vulnerabilities that humans have in our relations with materials, how materials come to matter in knowledge-making processes. So in early childhood education, the pervasive theoretical orientation tends to center developmental theories from Piaget and Vygotsky and their conceptions of language acquisition and development as a means for understanding the world. Conversely, the material turn builds from the work of multidisciplinary scholars who posit that the active materiality of the world is constitutive in the construction of discourse and reality. So within a post-human and a new materialist framing, attentiveness to language is not only verbal or written, it's not only human. This attention is composed with multiple languages, including the languages, for example, of materials such as fabrics, of drawings, of clay, paint, photographs, charcoal, stones, soil, rivers, the material actors of an inquiry. So what matters here is how an attentiveness to the languages of these materials and their specificity create conditions for inquiry to emerge in particular ways. For the plot to unfold, these languages have many qualities that are specific to their nature. And Vecchi writes that every language has its own grammar, its own specific nature, but it also has a structure disposed towards communication and relation. So the flows and rhythms of material languages propose something about the ways in which ideas emerge as humans come into contact with it. So for example, with the fabric experimentations that were discussed in the article by Sylvia Kind, Christina Vintimilla, and Veronica Bassini-Cacciabo this week, young children engaging with fabrics proposed particular ways of being that are often full-bodied with moves in bigger ways, while watercolor painting could be used in a very different, really different orientation and create a different context. It might gesture toward, smaller, finer, detailed work, more intimate work, whereas fabric work would suggest something more open and something more full-bodied in movement. Charcoal also has a language that travels, it contaminates, it moves across bodies and spaces with movements that are sometimes sneaky. The language of plastic has a particular grammar as well. In my pedagogical work in Ecuador, educators have been thinking about the languages of plastic materials in the art studio space in the school. And so we've noticed that the language of plastic is in some ways indestructible, it's flexible, inventively adaptive. Its languages are paradoxical in nature, The grammars of plastic allow it to weave seamlessly into the fibers of earth, air, and water. It holds together riverbanks beside our school. It settles into the intestines of small creatures. If listened to, these plastics communicate stories of toxic dependencies that really cannot be thrown away. And these grammars propose particular ways of being with plastic. In these encounters, plastic separates and seals, but they also contain, they also bring things together and hold them in place. So these are some examples of how we can think about the agency of materials beyond the child, that materials are already active before we even touch them. So Schultz, 2008, offers us an article to think with that wasn't included in the readings this week, but I just want to draw on a few points because he's writing a review of the Material Encounters catalog that was written by the same authors, some of the same authors of the article this week, Sylvia Kind, Veronica Bassini-Cacciabel, and Lori Kocher. So in it, he's highlighting their book and some of the questions that they're asking in a project that really highlighted the liveliness of materials in early childhood education. They were asking, what if materials shape us as much as we shape them? What if we were to attend to greater care, to the effects of things, to the manner in which objects move together? And what if, rather than inquiring about what a material is, literally, interpreting its physical qualities or confirming what we already know it to be, we instead direct our thinking toward what materials can do, attending to the occasion of materials' function and performativity in the world? So again, this is thinking with rather than about. Not naming what a material is or defining its qualities or prescribing its benefits for the developmental child, but noticing what materials actually do, what they transform, how they move. And I want to briefly draw on Deleuze when he thinks with Spinoza, as he writes, a body, however small it may be, is composed of an infinite number of particles. It is the relations of motion and rest, of speeds and slownesses between particles that define a body, the individuality or the specificity of a body. Second, a body affects other bodies or is affected by other bodies. It is this capacity for affecting and being affected that also defines a body in its specificity. The languages that we attach to these bodies affects their capacity to act, to affect and be affected. Thus, particular ways of educating enhance or decrease possibilities. So in this sentence, the languages that we attach to these bodies affects their capacity to act. Also shows how, with a post-human new materialist framing, we're considering language and discourse, but we're also considering how matter matters in the making of meaning. So post-human and new material pedagogies seek to create spaces and capacities that might be productive of a trajectory, of generating multiple points of intersection and possibilities. They aim to enhance more encounters, more interactions. Knowing that we'll never get something fully right, knowing that knowledge is always not yet, it's always unnameable, formed and reforming because it's always in relation with the other. So in visiting children's centers and viewing pedagogical documentation of particular settings or projects, we can see how theory is alive. And during the reading break, you were invited to visit the Early Childhood Pedagogies Collaboratory website and to notice how you might see theory alive there. So in visiting this website, how did you see theory alive? Theory creates the questions that we ask, how we understand learning, the language that we use in narrating particular inquiries, how we see the child, who we see the educator as. And in this week, in your virtual collaboratories, you're going to be engaging with a provocation that thinks more about making visible the theoretical orientations of a particular piece.